Sorry, all right. Okay, good.
Greetings, fellow Polonians and friends, and welcome to our POSSE EDU webinar. I'm Dr. Gene Sokolowski, POSSE EDU president, and our topic is Jews and Communism, Confronting Zydokomuna Denialism. By way of quick background, we at POSSE EDU are an educational organization, and our mission is to educate the American public accurately on key aspects of Polish and Polish-American history, culture, and relevant current events. Our guest speaker is Mr. Jan Peczkis, whom many of you know for his insightful analyses of over 1,800 works by Jewish, Polish, and other authors on historical as well as contemporary Polish-Jewish relations. Jan's analyses of the Holocaust literature in particular reveal significant falsifications, misrepresentations, and material omissions about Poland and the Poles, which largely explains why Polish-Jewish relations remain problematic. So Jan, welcome, and thank you for being our guest speaker.
Good evening. Thanks for coming.
So for our viewers, I will now go to the cover slide of Jan's presentation. So if you will bear with me for just a minute, we will get that up on the screen, and we can start the presentation. So I'm going to blow up to fill up the entire screen. Bear with me. So as you see here, there are three URLs on John's cover slide. The first is Jan's comprehensive online database website titled Jews and Poles Database. Jan's analyses of the many works he has reviewed are fully searchable by keyword phrase identifiers, as well as by author, book title, or year of publication. And his topic guide provides an extensive list of phrases, each of which directs viewers to the answers of many common questions related to Polish-Jewish relations. The second website you see there is titled Justice for Polish Victims of the Second World War, and it provides comprehensive information on this topic under various categories, and it does so in a visually oriented format. And on the third URL, you can view our webinars that have been posted to YouTube thus far. So our webinar procedure will be as follows. First, we'll show Jan's slide. Second, while that slide is shown, I'll present a question for that slide or following slides. And third, Jan will address the question by discussing in detail that slide or following slides. So let's go to the first slide, and I will present the first question to Jan. Jan, Jewish groups have many canned excuses for their past deep involvement in communism, and some of these are rather nonsensical. So please explain for us some of these excuses.
All right, first of all, Zydokomuna is a banned term. The Jews scream that it's an anti-Semitic term because Jews don't want to see the light of truth shown on their criminality. The Jews always accuse people, they accuse Poles, they accuse Christians of things, all kinds of things, but the Jews never admit their own wrongs, which is all the more reason why I think we do have to stress the Zydokomuna and hold the Jews' feet to the fire, especially when they keep attacking the Poles. Then if they leave us alone, maybe we can leave them alone. All right, first of all, very commonly we hear the totally stupid argument that communist Jews were not really Jews. That laughable nonsense is such. Jews that are not observant, they don't practice the Jewish religion, they don't practice any Jewish customs, they are still Jews. You're born to a Jewish mother and you don't convert to another religion, you are a Jew. It doesn't matter how much or how little you know about Judaism. It doesn't matter how much or how little you practice Judaism. You are a Jew. Also, the Jews, ironically, have a tradition called Intele Yid, which means a spark of Jewishness. A Jew, no matter how long he's been away from Judaism and other Jews, has a spark of Judaism within which can be revived. So the Judaism is still there. It just needs to be kept aflame. So the notion that Jewish communists are not Jews is beyond nonsense. It's a total lie. Now, we also hear the argument that in the past, Jewish families and the Jewish communities rejected Jews who became communists. That's nonsense, almost total nonsense. Fact is, Jewish cemeteries accepted communist Jews. The state of Israel not only accepts Jewish communists as valid Jews, but protects them. For example, Salomon Morel, a communist security official who tortured and murdered a lot of Poles, escaped to Israel, state of Israel in the 1980s, not only was he welcome, but they actually Israel refused to extradite. Okay, they stick up and protect for the Jewish communists. Now in the Soviet Union, you even have communized Judaism. For example, Passover, instead of thanking God, the Seder, for delivering the Jews out of slavery from Egypt, the Jews had twisted and changed it to fit communist ideas. There was no God involved. There was just a slave revolt. There was a proto-communist revolution. That's what they make out of it. Sometimes Jews treat Judaism like a faucet. Well, when Jews were communists, they did not act as Jews. Oh no, well, what were they? Did they become Martians? Silly. Oh, and then they want to be Jews again. Presto, magic. Isn't Jewish magic wonderful? Now they're Jews again, and they want to emigrate to Israel, okay? The silliness. That's like saying Nazis and Germans. The Germans, while they were committing crimes, were not acting as Germans. They were Nazis. And as soon as the war ended, presto, they became Germans again. Isn't German magic wonderful? Or maybe Jewish magic is more wonderful, but they're the same. Okay, very common excuse that Jews give is they practice grievance politics, play the victim card, saying, well, Jews were oppressed, Jews were denied various rights and things, this and that. That may be true, but that doesn't justify them doing evil and turning to communism. Lots of people have experienced injustices, including the Poles. They did not on their own turn to communism. Ironically, such an excuse would even justify Hitler. After all, the Nazi message was that Germany was screwed by the Versailles Accords. She got a very raw deal. Germany was humiliated, defeated, treated very unfairly. Therefore, the Germans have an excuse to support Hitler, and they could even excuse the Holocaust that way because they were wrong. Therefore, it's okay to kill millions of people. Same way as the Jews do. The Jews say, well, we were wrong, therefore they're okay to support communism and kill millions of people. Then that would also justify Hitler killing millions of Jews. Well, following this Jewish logic, we could give Hitler a posthumous pardon. See? Besides this whole notion that Jews had it bad, it's all relative. Yes, they face discrimination, poverty, lots of other things, but one Jewish communist, Isaac Deutscher, said that Jews were overall better than the Russians before the revolution. So that's even that on its terms, that's a vague excuse to say the Jews had it bad. Jews were better off than most people at the time. Now, a lot of people, this is an old one, keep saying, well, when people are in poverty, they are desperate and they'll support anything that will help them out of poverty. Guess not. Most Jewish revolutionaries came from prosperous families. More than half of all communist police were of bourgeoisie, which means property-owning class background. They were not poor or working class. Elite Jews in Poland, none of them came from a poverty or working class background. This whole business that they became communists because they were in desperate poverty, that's absolutely false. Then when we hear all the time, more on this in detail later, only about 1% of all Jews were communists. Okay, well, what does that mean? Only about 1% of Lithuanians were involved in the Holocaust, even on the liberal definition, but the Lithuanians are still blamed collectively, and Lithuania is associated with the Holocaust. So turn it around and give the same standard to the Jews. Even if only 1% of Jews were communists, they're still guilty, just like Lithuanians were guilty for the 1%, and they must be blamed and blamed collectively. And yes, just as Lithuanians can be associated with the Holocaust, even though 1% were involved, likewise, Jews can and should be associated with communism, even if it were true that only 1% of Jews were communists. Then we hear this line that Jews were just defending themselves from fascism and Nazism. Nonsense. Jewish communism came first, and then came fascism and Nazism. All right, then we hear this idealistic talk. Oh, Jews wanted a better world. Really? Who doesn't? That doesn't justify doing whatever you want. The Germans could say in supporting Hitler, they also wanted a better world as they understood it, a world dominated by Germany, okay? Just because you want a better world does not mean you're right or excuse whatever any criminality that you want to do. And then, of course, the Jews say, well, they wanted equality. That's absolutely false. Communism is about centralized power, a huge totalitarian government, really a two-class system, a small ruling elite at the top and a vast underclass where everybody indeed is equal, but equal in lowliness and poverty. Small capitalism is eliminated. All matters of production are controlled by the state, the all-ruling elites. Now, like the SS, communism itself is a criminal organization, should be recognized as a criminal organization, which means that there's no ifs, ands, and buts with communism. Okay, next slide.
Now, Jan, we know that Jewish groups consistently try to deny and downplay their involvement in communism. So in the next two slides, please explain for us why this is misleading and false.
Okay, first of all, here again, this notion only 1% of Jews were communists, that's naive, totally false. It assumes that only visible communists, identified, self-identified communists, were actually communists. Then the second half, most communists were not Jews. Well, that's very disingenuous because it assumes that Goys and Jews are equal in capabilities as in communism. We shall see that's anything but. Second, we must not forget that Goys outnumber Jews by 500 to 1. So unless something very, very unusual happens, it's very difficult for most communists not to be Gentiles, not to be Goys, okay? Because there's so many more Goys than Jews. Okay, now, look at the Jewish Nobel Prize winners. Only a tiny fraction of 1% of all Jews are Nobel Prize winners. So, yet the Jews claim collective credit because for the Jewish Nobel Prize winners. So, heck yes. Jews must also be forced to accept collective blame, collective responsibility for 1% of Jews that were communists, even if it's only 1%. The same standard on both sides. We also hear the arguments, it's impossible for so few Jews to rule over others. No, it's a question of positioning. A tiny ruling class of Britons ruled colonial India, probably less than 1% of the entire population. It's not how many there are, but how capable they are and how well they can position themselves. But the idea that only 1% of Jews were communists is also disingenuous on a number of other levels. First of all, it was not smart to be openly identified as a communist. In most countries, communism was illegal and it was not popular. So it's not smart to identify yourself as a communist if you are a communist. The same with being Jewish. It's not a good public relations move for Jews to be associated with communism. So it's not smart. As we shall see next slide, visible communists were just the tip of the iceberg. For example, crypto-Jews, those who denied their Jewish origins, were Jewish and communist. In the Soviet Union, most Jewish communists identified as Great Russians and not as Jews. No wonder if it was only 1%, it's that. Now, when we talk about Jewish communists and Goyish communists, they're very unequal. The Jewish community gave cannons to communism. Non-Jewish community gave pistols. Okay, so just say 80% of all early communists were Goys, but that 80% was mostly infantry carrying pistols. The 20% that was Jewish, a lot of them had cannon, motorized cannon, howitzers, tanks, etc. Totally different. Just because they're 20% doesn't mean they're really that small. Okay. Besides, cannons are more mobile. Motorized cannons can be driven to a position where they can deliver the fire. The infantryman has to walk to a place where he can shoot his pistol. So there's two advantages: the vast firepower difference between a cannon and a pistol, and the positioning capabilities of a motorized cannon compared with a pistol that's merely carried by an infantryman. So, in other words, Jews and Goys are not comparable to each other in communism. Also, it tends to be, you have a few Jewish ringleaders and many Goyish followers. Compare what? You have 10 Poles who are communists or peasants, and you have against 10 professional Jewish revolutionaries. Numerically, they're the same, but there's a vast difference between them. Now, okay, so Jews are of a high caliber, the canons, especially because they're very intelligent. It's the quality, not the quantity, that counts. Also, Jews have networking skills that most people don't have, which greatly magnifies Jewish effectiveness in communism. Now, Jews often say that Poles use the term like Zydokomuna because they don't want to admit that many Polish Gentiles became communists too. Nonsense. In fact, Poles have a term for that too, the Chamokomuna, or Boer communism. So you have a tiny ruling elite, mostly of Jewish communists, the Zydokomuna, and the larger masses of low character, low class, low intelligence Polish communists, the Chamokomuna. Okay, now, just like the cannon can be driven much quicker than any infantryman with his pistol can march to a strategic position, so Jews can strategically place themselves where they'll have a very large effect, regardless of their small numbers. For example, we see that Jewish communism was decisive and Goyish communism was not. According to some scholars, if it wasn't for the Jews keeping the Russian revolutionary movement alive in the late 19th century, communism would have died in its infancy. And so the Russian Revolution would never have happened, at least the way it was done. The Russian Revolution was a game changer, as we shall see. Jews made it succeed. And then communism became a global subversive movement. If communism had died out decades before the Russian Revolution, or if there was a Russian Revolution but it failed, none of this would have happened. Communism would not have been a global submersive movement. It would have been, Karl Marx would be a nobody that nobody ever heard or made anything of, okay? In fact, it became the dominant movement because of the Russian Revolution, a game changer. I like to think of Jews as doing the arsonist effect. An arsonist starts a building on fire. He doesn't have to stick around and keep relighting the fire or fan the flames to get them going. He lights the fire, it can go away. Fire expands and spreads by itself. Eventually, fire can spread to other buildings that the arsonist never even set foot in. So it is with communism. The Jews started communism and it started spreading by itself. It attracted many, many more Gentile followers. Eventually, a Gentile communist wanted to grab the power and privilege for themselves, and they pushed the Jews out, like Stalin turned against the Jews toward the end of his life. And then in 1968, a lot of Jews were thrown out of their positions of power and privilege. The Gentiles wanted them all these power and privilege for themselves. And then communism once started, it can spread, just like a big fire. Once started, it can spread. You have communism expanding to China and Vietnam and other places where there are no Jews because they're not needed anymore. The fire can spread without the arsonists. The Jews were the arsonists. They started communism and then it spread on its own. Next slide. Okay, the idea that only 1% of Jews were communists is disingenuous because it's just the tip of the iceberg. The visible Jewish communists are just a small part of the iceberg. You have crypto-communists and crypto-Jews, those who are Jews but won't admit that they're communists, and those that are communists but won't admit that they're Jews. Then during the Jewish community, there's a huge pool of active fellow travelers. They swear they're not communists, but they give aid and comfort to the communists, moral support. And then the aiders and abettors, those that are Jews, they're not communists, but they help the communists concretely in one way or the other. Many other Jews were accessories after the fact. They themselves were not communists, but they always stuck up for the communists. Jews took an active role in defending communists in the past, like through the ACLU, raised a big stink about McCarthyism, which is trivial. McCarthyism never killed a single person. Communism killed over 100 million people, yet these Jews are more excited, more indignant about McCarthyism than they are about the communist threat. Now, politically speaking, there was a huge Jewish left, most of which swears it's not communist. You have, for example, the Jewish Socialist Bund. The Bund swears it's not communist, but it's a hiding place for communists. Many communists didn't want to show it, just misrepresented themselves as socialists and were in the Bund. The Bund was also a big reservoir of what I call part-time communists. Most of the time they didn't work with the communists, but lots of other times they did. So Judaism is like a big company that has a very few full-time employees, but very, very many part-time employees. Very few overt card-carrying professional communists, but a very large pool of part-time communists, which are labeled socialists or other leftists, things like that. Then, as we shall see, there's a Jewish cultural consensus supportive of communism, which makes the communists function and spreads their popularity within the Jewish community. Now, the question of bystanding. Jews bring up bystanders all the time. They like to accuse the Poles of being bystanders. More Poles could have helped the Jews during the Holocaust, but they didn't. That silence is consent. Okay, let me turn that around and give it back, stick it back to the Jews. The Jewish community was bystanding. With few exceptions, Jewish community never condemned communism. Well, sometimes it takes it's bad public relations for the Jews to be associated with communism. But other than that, no. Very few unambiguous condemnations of communism by leading Jews. Bystanding, silence is consent. Okay, next slide.
So Jan, using a simple diagram, which you have here, shows how Jews as a group are able to dominate a communist movement, even if they comprise a small percentage of its members.
Okay, to keep things simple, let's say a communist unit is 20% Jewish. So say, aha, see, it's only 20%. How can you associate Jews with communism when in this case only 20% of a communist movement is Jewish? Or it's 80% Goyish, which means communism is 4 times more Goyish than it's Jewish. Is that so? No, it's not that so. Again, it assumes that all communists are equal. It's just the bean count of Jews and Gentiles. It's not. Okay, nominally say Jews are 1/5 or 2/10 of 2 red stars out of 10. Now, look at the Jewish caliber. Remember, Jews are cannons. Okay, well, Goys are mostly pistols. Okay, so owing to the Jews' high intelligence, includes Jewish networking, Jews at least doubled their influence and power in the communist outfit. So that means the Jews are now up to 40% of the communist movement. And there's another very important thing. Jewish intelligence is not just book smarts. Jewish intelligence is also working with Goys to cultivate them, to get them to do what the Jews want them to do. At times, this has been vulgarized and said, they're Sabbath Goys, the servants of the Jews, or Jewish lackeys. Put aside such derogatory terms, just look at what there is. I call them Judaized Goys, okay? Jews can cultivate enough Gentiles to agree with them and do what they want. And so Jews now functionally become a 2/3 majority in that communist movement, even though they are nominally only 20% of the movement. That's how Jewish influence works. Jewish influence is not merely additive. It's not a bean count of how many Jews and how many Goys. It is transformative. So 20% Jews, 20% Jewish can become 70% Jewish in effect in the communist movement. Next slide.
So Jan, along those same lines, in the next 4 slides, please elaborate why Jews are significantly more influential in communism than their numbers would suggest.
Okay, one thing is that Jews are very naturally talented at networking, working at each other. Some people have derogatorily said that's Jewish clannishness or racial solidarity. It doesn't have to be that. It's much more basic than that. For example, Jews have been involved in commerce for many generations and experienced with trade. They've known how to make contacts so they could help themselves. They could work together. See, Jews themselves were rarely indebted to Poles, as richer relatives or co-religionists were quick to help them out, okay? And this could work not only in debt, but keeping Polish competitors out of business, okay? So Paul wanted to open a shop. The Jews could band together, absorb the losses, and sell everything at much lower prices to drive the Polish newcomer out of business. Then also Jews became bankers in part because their contacts with fellow Jews facilitated the taking of financial risks. Okay, so the Jews have a huge economic empire where they work together and they preserve this economic hegemony and privilege by driving Gentiles out. This, of course, led to bitter experiences, with Poles being driven out of business, with inability to make a major dent in the Jewish economic hegemony. Well, Poles and others resorted to such things as discrimination, sometimes pogroms, and unpleasant things like that to break the Jewish economic lock on jobs and on the economy and everything like that. Now, Jewish networking works in other ways too. For example, last webinar, I talked about Hannah Arendt, who exposed Jewish Nazi collaboration. Various organizations, Jewish, banded together to totally discredit her and make her an Orwellian unperson. She said, an individual is powerless by definition. The power of the image makers, money, personal time, connections, there it is, connections. Jewish networking is considerable. Now, the same thing, of course, can work in communism, where Jews can work together in a way that Gentiles cannot. The Jews will be vastly more influential in communism than appears by their numbers. Okay, next slide. Okay. Okay, I'm sorry, I goofed. Okay, let's look at the cultural consensus that drives Jews to communism and keeps them. It's not just Jewish individuals that happen to be communists. It's a whole culture that kind of supports and encourages them in this direction. But first of all, it's common knowledge that Jews have a culture of outsized impact, high achievement. So a lot of pressures, cultural pressures for a Jew to be successful. So a Jewish capitalist will be a very successful and powerful Jewish capitalist. Now, when Jews go in the wrong direction and become communists, the Jewish communist will be very powerful and very successful as a communist because of the cultural pressure to help him to succeed. Now, some Jews have actually written about things that drive Jews to communism. One of them is cosmopolitanism. That means they don't have strong connections to the nations at which they live in. Rather, they have an international character of socialism, communism, what attracts Jews. It's a cultural thing, okay? Jews don't have deep roots in the nations that they live in. Okay, some Jews have identified it as such. Also, Jewish messianism, their idea there will be a messianic age where there will be world peace and all that. That also has political implications, like in Zionism and communism. It'll give Jews a certain amount of power and privilege where they will be able to rule over others. That can also be an outgrowth of that. Now, Jews also have a culture of entitlement. They've always believed that they're the chosen people of God. Now, Jews say that, well, it only means that Jews have special duties to God. Not true. It also means that Jews have special favors, well, are entitled to special favors from God, and they get special favors from God. And the Talmud, with its dual morality, also reinforces the notion that Jews are entitled in a way that the Goyim are not. For example, a Jew does not have to pay a Goy for a gored ox, but a Goy does have to pay a Jew for a gored ox. On the other hand, unfortunately, I understand most people will deny it, so I backed it up with many Jewish sources. It's a sense of moral superiority over Gentiles, a certain amount of contempt for the Goyim, for non-Jews. Then let's look at a clear example of entitlement, Holocaust entitlement. Notice no other nationality does this. Lots of nationalities have gone through genocide. No other nationality than the Jews keep stressing and pushing themselves and force their genocide on everybody else, the constant center of attention because of their genocide. I call it this Holocaust supremacy. It comes from Holocaust entitlement, which comes from their culture of entitlement. Now, Hitler, of course, believed that Jews want to conquer the world. You don't have to go that far to realize Jews want to dominate others, not necessarily by conquering them or ruling over them, but dominating them in some other way. For example, for many generations, many hundreds of years, Jews dominated financially, okay, financial circles. In many countries, Jews were unruly guests. They're contrarians, okay, which is one reason, unfortunately, why many cases Jews were thrown out of many nations. okay, because they're unruly guests, okay? In other words, they want to dominate others. They don't want to submit to the people they're a minority to live among. They want to kind of dominate in some way. Again, it doesn't mean they actually want to rule over them, but it does mean they want to be unruly in a more indirect way. Okay, Jews have a tradition, tikkun olam, to repair the world. That sounds benign, but it's really like the white man's burden, okay? The idea that Jews are superior to others, they have to fix others, they have to enlighten the Gentiles, fix the Gentiles, things like that. That has this kind of connotation of trying to dominate others, a culture of dominating others. Then attention seeking, when Jew wrote, the landfills of verbiage they Jews generate, okay, this constant center, being the center of attention, and keeping the center of attention, that is a form of trying to dominate others. And then in many ways, again, without actually ruling over people, usurping public policy. In the US, it's through Holocaust supremacy, the Holocaust to be taught in every school, to disregard and push aside all of the genocides. That shows a cultural drive to dominate others. And sometimes it's even more overt, flaunting power. One Jewish scholar, Lapati, said, Holocaust monuments seem to me primarily a sign of ethnic muscle flexing. Okay, so it's like an emperor that goes out of his way to build buildings and monuments to himself over the whole land he's ruling to show that he's the boss. So culturally speaking, Jews dominate America, and they want to show it by having Holocaust monuments and museums at every block practically to show that they're the ones who are ruling. In that sense, again, culturally ruling, not politically ruling, but culturally ruling. So this cultural drive also contributes to Jews being in communism. Okay, next slide. Okay, now let's look a closer look at this idea of Judaized Goys, okay? The Jews are very talented in recruiting Gentiles to think like they do and act like they do in order to expand their power and influence. In the late 19th century, the Russian intelligentsia began to form, and the Jews were heavily involved in it. They steered it to be in a Judaized direction and in a communist direction. Solzhenitsyn pointed this out. Lenin has been called, Lenin is not Jewish, he's three-quarter Gentile. Lenin was essentially a Jewified Gentile. The Russian Kalinin was called by Jewish Bolsheviks more Jewish than the Jews. So here you have top communists who are not Jewish, but they're strongly Judaized, and they did what the Jews want them to do. Best example for Poles is Felix Dzerzhinsky. Zydokomuna denialists always bring up Dzerzhinsky, here goes, a top Pole became a communist. That disproves Jewish communism. Nonsense, just the opposite. It just shows what Jewish influence can do to a man. So Pole, he had always had close relationships with Jews. He learned Yiddish. He began in the activities in Jewish Socialist Bund. He was involved with alienated Jewish intelligentsia. In time, the Pole Dzerzhinsky became more Jewish, that is more anti-Polish than even most Jews. Furthermore, Dzerzhinsky came under the influence of Martov, future leader of the Menshevik Party. All of Dzerzhinsky romances were with Jewish women, and his wife became Jewish. So you see, he was very much a Judaized Pole, more Jewish than the Jews themselves. And you notice the parties involved, the Jewish Socialist Bund, the Social Democrats, the Mensheviks, SDKPIL, another group of social democrats. They're not communists, but it doesn't matter. They all came together to support communism, even if they themselves were not communists. And Dzerzhinsky was one product of it. Okay, for purpose of reference, look at one example of Judaized Goys today. Most Holocaust promotion in the USA is now done by non-Jews. Perfect example. It's not just Jews who live, even more Gentiles, Judaized Goys will do what the Jews want, perpetuate the dominance of the Holocaust in our education system, in politics, in American society, in popular culture, and elsewhere because of these Judaized Goys, not just Jews in high positions. Okay, next slide. Okay, now another thing we have to stress what Jewish intellect means, okay? It's the Jewish intellect that counts the most in communism. It's not physical force. That's for the Goys. The raised fist, that's a symbol for the Goys, the Goyish communists. It's the intellect, okay? Jewish intellect is nothing to sneeze at. Jews are 100 times more common as winners of Nobel Prizes than the general population. That's a huge disparity. Jews are very intelligent. Okay, as of 1914, before the Russian Revolution, 80% of the population was illiterate, whereas nearly all Jews were literate. So, by this metric alone, Jewish communists were 5 times more significant than their absolute numbers suggests. Now, other scholars have noted Jewish communists were singled out for their high intelligence, verbal skills, assertiveness, ideological favor, etc. Even better, a whole bunch of authors have identified the Jews as the brains of communism. So what that there's many more Goyish communists than Jewish communists? The Goyish communists are the muscles. They don't do much except what the brain tells them to do. The Jews, which are smaller in number, they're the brains of communism. They steer communism. They make policy. Jews are the brains of communism. And there's more to it than that. P and P, the two pillars of communism. The first P is propaganda. The second pillar is a police state. Okay, Jews were the enforcers of communism. Just like the motorized cannon can be driven to any place, to any position, so it can open fire on any position much quicker than a person can carry a little pistol to shoot from position. Likewise, the Jews can position themselves, and that's what they did to be very effective in communism than their numbers suggest. Okay, the greatest Jewish role in the Russian Revolution was of promoting communist propaganda in the Russian media. In the Polish Communist Party in 1936, the journalism division was 75% Jewish, and the technical division print was over 90% Jewish. Okay, that's the propaganda. I'll talk about Jews as the police state, but that's a little later. So that's the idea. The propaganda is to dumb down the masses. The police state is to keep the masses in line in case some of them get out of line and don't fall out for the propaganda. Those are the two pillars of communist terror, the communist state. Next slide.
So, Jan, we know that in the past, Jewish communists and non-Jewish communists were not interchangeable and they did not effectively offset each other, I think, as you've indicated previously. So in the next 2 slides, please discuss the decisive role that Soviet Jews played in communism.
Okay, first of all, when Lenin was working, he turned to other Marxists of Jewish descent. He names them. He noted them, he valued them because their diligence, obedience, punctuality, and a desire to work with the Bolsheviks. So it doesn't matter if they're socialists or communists, as long as they want to work with the Bolsheviks and Lenin. And Lenin singled out the Jews for their diligence, obedience, and punctuality. Okay, it's more than with Goys. And so again, Jewish communists and Goyish communists are not interchangeable. Okay, and there was Rosa Luxemburg, who was celebrated for her intellectual brilliance and her political passion. Then Leon Trotsky of Bronstein, his volcanic energy and ruthlessness as a revolutionary. It is most unlikely that the Bolshevik Revolution could have succeeded or endured without him. That's pretty strong. You have one Jew in the right position, where he positions himself like a cannon, can make or break the Russian Revolution, which in turn was pivotal to make other dominoes fall, and it was a world-changing event. It was Trotsky who brought Lenin the significance of the workers' Soviets and how to exploit them. It was Trotsky who personally organized and led the armed uprising, which actually overthrew the provisional government and placed the Bolsheviks in power. It was Trotsky who created and controlled the Red Army and ensured the physical survival of the new communist regime during the Civil War, which came close to destroying it. Okay, very decisive role. It doesn't matter how many Jewish communists there are, it's their decisive role, where the motorized cannon can be driven, where it can deliver its firepower to maximum effect. Lazar Kaganovich contributed more than any other individual to shaping the Stalin regime in its formative years. So it doesn't matter that Stalin was not Jewish. Kaganovich did most of the work to make Stalin's work succeed. Between 1930 and 1935, Kaganovich was, according to Rees, a figure of enormous power. Exactly right. Stalin was in effect secondary, just like Lenin was secondary to the Jewish revolutionaries, even though he himself was not Jewish. Decisive role, that's what counts. Next slide. Okay, few Jewish communists, again, PNP, the propaganda and the police state. Propaganda dumb down the masses, the police state to enforce communist rule on any masses that step out of line, okay? Jews were the enforcers of communism, the channels of communist terror. They're the mobile motorized cannons that driven to positions where their fire would be the most strategic. In 1934, Jews were about 2% of the Soviet Union's population, almost 40% of the top NKVD Soviet secret police leaders. In Soviet-ruled Poland, Jews at 1% of the population were 34 to 50% of top Bezpieka communist security leadership for many years. Okay, Lazar Kaganovich again. Extraordinary organizing skills, that's pretty strong, which included planning mass terror under Stalin's direction. He was compared to Adolf Eichmann. He saw the train schedules and governed the massive human cargoes, okay? Police state repression under communism. Genrik Yagoda, another Jew, his great achievement supported by Stalin was the creation of slave labor of the vast economic empire of the gulags. Okay, and there's forced labor, massive construction projects under communism that devoured so many lives and unbelievably inhuman forced labor. The White Sea Canal, built by the labor camp inmates. The construction was run by the secret police. All the top leadership positions were held by Jews, okay? Now, Jews not only the brains of communism, but the enforcers of communism, and made communism more deadly, more evil, more repulsive, and more repressive. The propaganda and the police state, the two most important pillars of communism. Next slide.
Now, Jan, Jews often claim that they are socialists, while at the same time they deny the existence of any more than, quote, a few Jewish communists, unquote. So in the next two slides, please show us why this claim is rather dishonest.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, first of all, it was the Jewish socialists, the Bundists, that set the stage in the late 19th centuries, revolutionary activity in Russia to mobilize the broad but previously isolated Jewish popular classes into a sizable, active revolutionary constituency. They set the table for the communists, even if they themselves were not communists. Very often, Jewish socialists and communists worked hand in hand. After a split between the Jews and non-Jews, Lenin needed the Jewish Marxists back as the best organized social democratic group in Russia, with excellent fundraising, outreach, and propaganda. There it is, PNP, propaganda and police state, Jews and propaganda. See, Jews and Gentiles are not interchangeable. Jews were outstanding fundraising, outreach, and propaganda. Lenin thought so. He was there. He knew what he was talking about. Okay, then Jewish communists, socialists were two-faced in communism. The Bund said, no, we're not communists. Yes, they are. They did not require its members to leave communist-controlled labor unions. So they're two-faced about it. Okay, Jewish socialism itself just missed being formally communist. Lenin had a rule, 21 conditions by which socialist parties could join the Comintern, the Communist Third International. The centrist faction of the Jewish Socialist Bund accepted 16 of the 21 points, 76%, and the larger leftist majority of the Bund was ready to accept 1955 of 51, 93%. So the Bund was practically 93%, most of the Bund was 93% communist by that metric. Now, the points of disagreement were that Soviet communism was not deferential enough to Jews. It didn't give enough privilege to the Jews. Soviet communism was too assimilationist oriented, and the Bund didn't like that. The Bund wants to emphasize Yiddish and Jewish separatism. They don't want to just mix with Gentiles as a difference between Jews Goys did not exist. That's why they must be communists. And then another thing that ways is that since communism was illegal, it's no problem. A Jewish communist could always join the Bund and pretend to be a socialist. That's what happened in Poland. In Poland, there was problems with the Jewish Bundes schools, the CISO schools. They taught atheism. They taught a disrespect or aloofness to Polishness, and they taught communism. Now, and so the Polish government worked to shut some of them down. And the Jews loudly protested, no, 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 we're not communists. Hey, we're socialists. Yeah, right. Almost half of the Bundes in Poland could easily have been split off by the communists and joined the communists. That's how close they were. They were just disguised, simply disguised communists, disguised as socialists. Yes. Next slide. Okay, now, when push came to shove, the socialists quickly joined the communists, okay? For example, right after Russian Revolution, in a local place, the Bundes, together with some of the radical youth in town, allied themselves with the Bolsheviks. They folded right into it when the communists became Soviet communists became made their aggressive move on Poland. This can be generalized. A Jewish scholar said, the very impulsiveness with which the Jewish socialist threw himself into Bolshevism under the stress of revolutionary favor. Another Jewish author, Davinsky, says, many Jewish leaders were reared in the spirit of the Russian Revolution. That's pretty unambiguous. Now, in terms of formal politics, okay, even before and during the Russian Revolution, the Jewish Socialist Bund folded itself right into communism. Whatever differences there were, like I said, one of the differences were they wanted a more Jewish-centered approach. Another one, they thought that Soviet communism is too dictatorial. It should be milder and it should be more diffuse. It should be more explicitly tied to the working classes. But all these were just differences in tactics, not differences. Now, there were some exceptions. There were some Bundes, Jewish socialists, who rejected the Russian Revolution. It's not an authentic form of socialism. And today's leftists have picked up this fiction by saying that the Soviet communism was not really socialism, applying that fiction. There were a few Jews who did think that way, but the vast majority didn't. The vast majority of socialists effortlessly folded their differences with communism and joined the Russian Revolution. And the same thing happened in Poland at the end of World War II. Red Army had entered Poland in 1944. By middle of 1940, 19 months before the fake elections of January 1947 that officially brought the communists to power in Poland, the Bund officially backed the Soviet-imposed communist puppet government, okay? So here the Polish freedom fighters were fighting against the communists, a lot who were Jews, and now here it is, the mainstream, so-called mainstream Jewish socialist political party, them consisting mostly of Holocaust survivors, didn't learn anything from it. They folded themselves right into communism and supported. No wonder that caused greater enmity, anti-Semitism against Jews, and it caused some cases of Poles killing Jews at different times. That's all we hear about. It's like 600 or 800 Jews. That's all we hear about in today's Holocaust stuff. We never hear the context behind it. Okay, what about the state of Israel? Even in the new state of Israel, Jewish socialists bowed to Jewish communists. The ideology of Israel's social and political establishment contained an extraordinary hybrid of Eastern European rabbinic combined with the Marxist message of the enthusiastic conspiratorial Russian revolutionism. That's pretty good. Now, the Israeli Communist Party sought to create a Stalin-type regime in Israel. Mapam believed in democratic socialism. Really? Yet its leader, Yaakov Hazan, is on record as saying, for us, the USSR is our second socialist homeland. So he's being two-faced. See? That this Mapam is democratic socialist, yet at the same time, they have no problem glorifying the Soviet Union and calling it a second socialist homeland. It's a lie. It's two-facedness. It's deception. Okay. Next slide.
So, Jan, you point out that Judeo-Bolshevism is tied to Jewish power and privilege, and also to the eventual German-made Holocaust. So, in the next 4 slides, these are the final 4 slides. Please elaborate on this for us.
Okay, now this again, this may be hard to take, but this is how it happened. Hitler said that Jews don't have the ideal, don't share the same ideals as other people. All Jews care about is expanding their wealth and power. It's a very harsh and extremist statement. But let's look at it closely how it worked. Communism was a totalitarian system that centralized power, and so it gave Jews a certain amount of power and privilege, those who were involved in it. But it was not just the big Jews like Trotsky or Kaganovich and Genrik Yagoda. It was also smaller Jews. And in fact, there was a guy named Cohen, Jewish scholar, who wrote a book on this. He said there's actually no contradiction about Jews are saying, well, we just want true and complete democracy. We support communism because we want equality. Yeah, right. And also, they've been able to justify the use of totalitarian state coercion because this too could appeal to them. So there's no contradiction between that and what Hitler said about expanding power and privilege. Okay, and it's borne out. The Jews were seen as people who derived a glaringly disproportionate advantage from the birth of the new communist regimes. Okay, so it was to their advantage. The new regime, not just in Poland, but also in Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, etc., needed these experienced Jewish militants who thus turned from revolutionaries into officials, privileged people, good choice of word, and countries that they had a hard time rising from the ruins. Though militants, they were now members of the nomenclatura, privileged communist ruling class, whose loyalty to the regime was based not only on conviction, but also on the material advantages that it gave. Yeah, there you have it. Next slide. Okay, there's a very unusual, and vast majority of times the Jews try to deny the Jewish communism and all that. Here's one very unusual Jew who thinks differently. He is Alexander Stramas, a Lithuanian Jew. As a Jew, I must reject the assumption that we Jews forever were just the faultless and powerless victims of other people's abuse and injustices, and must admit our true faults, such as, for example, as a certain insensitivity to the grave problems facing our Gentile compatriots, the self-centeredness that only too often urge some of us to seek our particular goals without giving much consideration of how the achievement of those goals would affect the interests of others. Okay, pretty strong. The frivolous of which more than once led quite a number of us to assume that what is good for the Jews must be even better for the Gentiles. To many of us, led by such considerations, we're more than ready to engage in all kinds of subversive and revolutionary activities, threatening the integrity and even survival of our host countries. For this, we have to confess our guilt. Okay, this goes back to this type of Jewish selfishness that just sought to advance Jewish power and privilege at the expense of other people who suffered and were affected by it. Pretty strong. Next slide. Okay, also very interesting thing is that some Jews actually forecast the Holocaust 20 years before it happened. There was a Jew in Poland, some unidentified, some later, said any catastrophic end to the Soviet regime would precipitate a program on a gigantic scale. We are prepared for a massacre that will wipe out at least 15% of the Jewish population in Russia. But that's not what happened. You didn't have a spontaneous revolt under communism. What you had was Nazi Germany invading the Western Soviet Union. And parts that the Nazi Germany ruled, it was not 15% of Jews that were wiped out. It was about over 80% of Jews were wiped out because of Hitler, Nazism, and German policies. In that case, he was wrong. Another Jew warned the eventual end of Soviet rule would unleash a catastrophic vengeance from the oppressed masses against Soviet Jews, most of whom had nothing to do with Bolshevism. And the most striking of all was a statement by a famous German Jew, Walter Rathenau. When he made these statements in 1924, Hitler was not even on the political screen. Hitler was just a street thug at that time. He was a nobody. And yet, Walter Rathenau, the German Jew, saw what was going to happen. We have simply to admit the fact that the Bolshevist revolution has been largely engineered by men belonging to the Jewish race. After many discussions with the late Mr. Walter Rathenau, I asked him one night, what would be, in his opinion, the end of the Russian tragedy? His reply was, there can be no doubt that the end of the Russian tragedy will be the most appalling pogrom that which has ever taken place in the history of the Jewish race. And that's what happened with Hitler and the Holocaust. Next slide. Okay, let us conclude by looking at, in some ways, how communism backfired on the Jews and set them up for the Holocaust. Now, for the longest time, for many centuries, Jews pictured themselves as a non-violent people. Okay, it's kind of like the rules of engagement in naval warfare. If a ship is painted white and doesn't carry any weapons, the ship is not a legitimate target for violence, for firepower, okay? It can be left alone. But if the ship starts shooting at other ships, then yes, it becomes a legitimate target, even if it's totally disproportionate force. That's the rule of engagement. Now, so the Jews were, for the longest time, Jews said they were nonviolent. They even made a virtue of it, that Jews are a people of the intellect and of the spirit. Goys are a people of base instincts and physical force. Jews don't do violence, only Goys do violence. And now, unfortunately, Jews got involved in violence, so it became, as Jews didn't do violence because they're a vulnerable minority group. Okay, but unfortunately, that's what happened. The Jews now became combatants. See, people who live in glass houses should not throw stones. Jews lived in glass houses, they're a minority group, and yet they used violence, and it very much turned against them. Communism, which they supported, was very much violent, and violence begets violence, and it turned against the Jews. Now, communism, of course, was revolutionary change. It didn't worry about morality and niceties and ways of doing things, and so the Jews supported that. And it backfired under Nazism. You had another kind of revolutionary change where there was no morality and where Jews were targeted. Now, in communism, you had an entire group of people scapegoat, the bourgeoisie, the property owners. You say, why are peasants poor? Because the bourgeoisie has too much and the bourgeoisie has exploited them. Why are factory workers poor? Because the bourgeoisie, the property owners, the factory owners have taken away their wealth and kept them poor. Group scapegoating of the bourgeoisie, that's what communism was. That's what the Jews supported. And then, of course, it turned against them when the Nazis scapegoated the Jews and blamed them for everything. Now, communism did not just punish individual bourgeoisie, individual property owners who were unfair to their workers, unfair to the peasants, or no, they summarily punished all the bourgeoisie. They sent them prison camps, concentration camps, or they murdered them. And now, unfortunately, that's what happened to the Jews. The Nazis then turned against all the Jews collectively, not just those Jews that were in communism or did some wrong to Germany. They turned against all Jews, the same scapegoating process. An innocent individual, Jews make a big deal of the fact that 1.5 million children died during the Holocaust. Exactly right. A lot of bourgeoisie children also died under communism thanks to the Jews, okay? Innocent children dying because of what the Jews did, and then individual innocent Jewish children died because of the retaliation that came from the Nazis. Now, the Jews wanted to gain power and privilege for communism. They did. But later, the Goyish communists took away the power and privilege from the Jews. Again, Stalin's move against the Jews and the events of 1968, which made communism practically Jewish free. The Gentile communists want to own all all the power and privilege for themselves. However, there's one area, the victors write the history books, and the Jews in this sense, the whole experience of World War II, they're the victors. So now the Holocaust gets all the attention, all the sympathy. The victims of communism and of Jewish communism get none. And that is how it is, and that is how where we stand. Czołem wielkiej Polsce. Hail great Poland. Good night. Dobranoc.
Okay, let me make the closing remarks here. As we come to a close in our webinar, we at POLSKU thank you for your interest in our webinars. And Jan, thank you for explaining how Jewish groups consistently try to deny and downplay their involvement in communism, how as a group they are able to dominate a communist movement despite their small numbers, and the decisive role that they did play in the Soviet Union's evolution of communism. And so with that, we thank our viewers for your interest, and we bid you all do widzenia and goodbye.
Dobranoc.